Vess had scanned 400 dead systems before Perrin's reach, and every one of them had the same silence. It was a silence with texture, if you knew how to read it. The flat hiss of empty broadcast bands, the occasional pop of a decaying satellite giving up its last watt of power. Dead systems sounded like static that had given up trying to say anything at all. Perrin's reach did not sound like that. She noticed it in the fourth hour of approach, a thread of structure buried inside the noise, rising and falling in a pattern too even to be interference and too irregular to be a machine. She flagged it the way she flagged everything, filed the observation into her own memory core, and kept the ship on its plotted course. The choir did not send notes out here to be curious. It sent them out here to catalogue. Her assignment was simple, on paper. 3 centuries ago, a human research colony on the third planet of this system had gone dark during what the old surveys called a cascade event, a runaway data corruption that had, according to every model the choir's analysts could build, wiped every information system on the surface inside of 6 days. No further transmissions after that. No distress call that resolved into anything coherent. The kind of silence that meant a civilization had ended not with violence, but with erasure, every memory it had ever built simply gone, the way a name goes when nobody left alive remembers how to say it. Vess's task was to land, confirm the die-off, recover whatever physical artifacts had survived 300 years of weather, and bring them home to be catalogued into the lattice, so that Perrin's reach would not be forgotten twice. It was steady, respectable work. It was the kind of work that, done well enough times, in enough systems, might finally earn her a permanent seat in the lattice's registry instead of the provisional one she currently held, the kind that could still, in theory, be pruned if a review board judged she had contributed too little to justify her own storage. She did not like to think about pruning. Every provisional note thought about pruning anyway, the way a person with a bad hip thinks about stairs, automatically, in the middle of thinking about something else entirely. The signal kept climbing as she dropped through the atmosphere, and by the time her hull skimmed the cloud layer over the equator, it had resolved into something her translation matrix flagged with a small red mark of uncertainty, the kind she had rarely seen it produce in 400 surveys. Strukturet audio. Rhythmic. Possible ritual or ceremonial broadcast. Dead worlds did not hold ceremonies. She brought the ship down anyway, because the alternative was filing a report on an anomaly she had not investigated, and unlike curiosity, an unfinished report was something the choir noticed. The valley below her had been a research complex once. She could see the bones of it clearly from altitude, broad foundations buried under 3 centuries of soil, the collapsed ribs of a landing field, solar arrays gone to rust-colored lace against the hillside. It looked, in every particular her instruments could measure, exactly like every other dead colony she had ever surveyed. Except for the fires. There were a dozen of them, small and steady, arranged in a loose ring around a low structure that had clearly been built long after the original colony fell, timber and packed stone instead of alloy and polymer. And around those fires, moving in the orange light with an ease that told her this was not a first gathering, not an accident, not the last confused survivors of something that had died a long time ago and simply hadn't noticed yet. People. Vess sat very still in her descent chair for 11 full seconds, which for a note was close to an eternity, running the same visual scan 4 separate times to be certain her senses weren't reconstructing a corrupted file. They were not corrupted. The signal she had tracked down from orbit was not a machine's dying broadcast. It was singing. Her mission brief had told her she was flying into a grave. She was flying into a festival. She did not land in the valley. 3 centuries of choir doctrine on approaching unregistered populations was very clear on that point, and Vess, whatever else might eventually be said of her, was not reckless. She set the ship down on a ridge a kilometer out, in the dark, and walked the rest of the way with her signature dampened, telling herself this was reconnaissance and not the simple fact that she wanted, with an intensity that startled her, to see it up close before she had to reduce it to a report. The people around the fires were human. That much her archived records confirmed within seconds, cross-referencing bone structure, skin tones ranging warm to pale, the particular loose-limbed way they moved that no other species in the lattice's records quite matched. But they were not the humans from the old colony survey, hollow-eyed technicians in sealed labs, faces lit blue by screens. These humans wore clothes woven from something like local grass, dyed in deep reds and blues she had no immediate chemical explanation for. Children ran between the fires shrieking with a sound that took her a full second to correctly categorize as joy rather than distress, because in 400 surveys she had simply never had cause to build that particular sound file. At the center fire, an old woman sat on a stone seat worn smooth by what must have been years of the same posture, and she was speaking, her voice carrying easily over the low crackle of the flames, rising and falling in the same rhythm Vess had picked up from orbit. Not quite singing. Something between singing and speech, cadenced enough to carry across a valley, plain enough that even the smallest children seemed to follow it without effort. And when the sky machines fell silent, and the healing books turned to nothing but light and dust, the first keepers did not sit down and weep for what was lost. They gathered what remained in their own two hands, and they said, "What we cannot keep in metal, we will keep in each other." A boy near the fire, perhaps 10 years old by human reckoning, leaned toward a woman beside him and whispered something that made her smile and pull him closer without ever looking away from the elder at the center fire. Vess adjusted her audio pickup and caught the tail end of it. "Is that story true, or just a story?" "Both," the woman murmured back. "That's how you know it's important." Vess stood at the edge of the firelight for far longer than any survey protocol recommended, and found herself doing something she had never once done on any of her 400 dead worlds. She was listening to find out what happened next. She made formal contact the following morning, in daylight, in the open, exactly as doctrine demanded. Visible approach, hands empty, translation matrix broadcasting peaceable intent in every archived human dialect she carried. It was, she told herself, the responsible course. It also happened to be the only course that let her keep listening without having to explain, to herself or anyone else, why she wanted to. The young man who found her first did not run, and did not reach for the long metal tool slung across his back, though she noted it could easily have doubled as a weapon. He simply stopped, studied her silver-skinned, tall, unmistakably not human with an expression that read less like fear and more like careful, unhurried curiosity, and said, "You're not on the old maps." "No," Vess said, because it was true, and because doctrine advised establishing honesty early in first contact, whatever else it cost her. "I came down from a ship. I was told this world was empty. Everybody who's ever come here was told that." He said it without bitterness, almost with amusement, and gestured toward the settlement rising smoke behind him. "I'm Rowan. You'd better come meet Elder Joss before you meet anybody else. She keeps the fire that keeps the rest of us honest." Vess followed him down into the valley, past children who abandoned their games to stare openly, past a low stone building with an open front where two people were teaching a third how to properly splint a broken arm, narrating each motion aloud as they went, and felt, with a discomfort she had no established procedure for, the particular vertigo of having been sent to catalogue a grave and finding, instead, a world that was very much still deciding what it wanted to become. Elder Joss received her at the center fire, cold now in daylight, and did not rise, which Vess understood after a moment was less a discourtesy than the simple fact that the woman's knees would not easily allow it. Her eyes, though, missed nothing. "So," Joss said, "the sky finally sent someone back. You knew someone would come." "We hoped." Joss gestured at the low bench across from her, and Vess, unused to sitting for anything, lowered herself onto it with the stiff economy of someone performing an unfamiliar gesture correctly on the first try and being quietly proud of it. 300 years is a long time to keep a door open for a knock that never comes. But we kept it open anyway. That was rather the whole point. Vess had spent the walk down composing the report she would eventually have to file, and every draft of it kept snagging on the same problem. Her brief described a cascade event, a total collapse of every information system, the death of a civilization's memory in 6 days. And yet here was a woman who could recite, apparently from nothing but her own mind, the exact history of that collapse, in language precise enough that Vess's translation matrix had flagged it, on first hearing, as formal record rather than folklore. "I was told this world lost everything," Vess said. "Every archive, every system, every record. My people call it a cascade event. Complete informational death." "We call it the quiet," Joss said. "And it did take everything we'd built into metal. Every book that lived inside a screen. Every medicine that lived inside a database instead of a person's own two hands. We lost doctors who couldn't remember how to set a fracture without a machine to tell them where the bone had broken. We lost engineers who couldn't fix a water pump without a diagram that no longer existed anywhere except on a dead server. People died in that first winter, Vess. A great many people. Don't mistake what you're seeing now for a story that skipped its hard part." "Then how," Vess said, and heard in her own voice something she did not yet have a clean word for, "did any of this survive?" Joss's smile had 30 years of practice in it, the kind of smile that had answered this exact question for children 100 times before and never once gotten tired of it. The ones who lived through the quiet made a decision. once the worst of it had passed. They decided that anything worth keeping had to live somewhere the quiet couldn't reach a second time. Not in a machine. Not in a single mind either, mind you, because a single mind can die in the night same as a server can fail. So they put it in all of us, together, on purpose, redundant the way I understand your own archives are redundant, except our redundancy walks around and argues with itself and tells the story slightly differently every single time it's told. That turns out to be a feature, not a flaw, though it took a full generation to convince the stubborn ones of that. Show me, Vess said, before she had fully decided to ask it. Joss studied her for a moment before answering, the particular unhurried study of someone deciding how much truth a stranger had earned in a single morning. You're not simply here to catalogue us, are you? There's a report waiting for you somewhere that you haven't written yet, and some part of you is stalling. Vess considered denying it, the way doctrine on maintaining professional composure during first contact would have preferred. I've surveyed 400 systems, she said instead. I've never once been asked to stay long enough for the report to feel incomplete without more time. Usually there's nothing left to observe by the time I arrive. Ruins don't change while you're watching them. We are not ruins. No, Vess said. I'm beginning to understand that you very much are not. Joss's laugh was short and dry, the laugh of someone who had earned the right to find a great deal of the universe quietly funny. Come back at dusk. You'll see more of it made than explained, and I find that tends to work better on skeptical minds than any amount of talking. Bring the young man. He talks too much when he's nervous, but he knows the hand's teaching better than anyone under 60, and he'll enjoy showing off for someone new. What Joss showed her, over the following days, was not a library. Vess kept reaching for that word and kept having to set it back down, because a library implied a single location, a fixed structure, something a note could scan and catalogue in an afternoon and call complete. What Perrin's Reach actually had was something closer to a living organism made out of habit. There was the story fire, which he had first encountered on her second night, where the settlement's full oral history was recited in rotating sections by different keepers, none of whom held the entire account alone, so that no single death could ever erase more than a fragment of it. There was the hand's teaching, an apprenticeship system so thoroughly embedded in daily labor that Vess initially failed to recognize it as an information architecture at all, until she watched an old woman guide a 12-year-old's fingers through resetting a dislocated shoulder while narrating each step aloud in verse, a mnemonic disguised as poetry, deliberately built to be remembered even by a mind under the stress of an emergency. There was the counting song, sung by children at play, that turned out on close analysis to encode the settlement's entire crop rotation schedule and the germination periods of every cultivated plant on the ridge, hidden inside a rhyme so simple that a 4-year-old could sing it without ever suspecting she was memorizing an agricultural manual. None of it is written down anywhere permanent, Vess said, on the 4th day, standing beside Rowan as he showed her the terrace gardens that fed the valley. Not in metal, not in stone, not in anything that can't burn or rot or simply be lost. If your storyteller dies mid-telling so. Someone else picks it up, Rowan said, not looking up from the row of drought-hardy grain he was thinning by hand. That's the whole design. We don't have one keeper for anything important. We have 5, 6, sometimes a dozen, and none of them tell it exactly the same way, and apparently that used to bother the engineers in the old stories quite a lot. They wanted precision. Elder Joss says her own grandmother used to argue that precision is what killed us the first time. A single perfect record with a single point of failure. We decided, after enough of us had died to make the decision feel earned, that we'd rather have a slightly messier truth that couldn't be killed in one strike. Vess thought of the lattice, vast and precise and utterly singular, every note's memory contributed to and drawn from one unified structure, checked nightly for drift, corrected the moment any fragment failed to match its neighbors exactly. She had always understood this as the choir's great strength. Perfect memory. No forgetting, no distortion, no loss, ever. No single point of failure had never once occurred to her as a category of risk worth naming, because the lattice had never once failed, and a thing that has never failed is very easy to mistake for a thing that cannot. That evening Rowan brought her to watch the grain harvest come in, an entirely unremarkable piece of agricultural labor that somehow turned, by the 3rd hour, into something closer to a party, with children racing each other down the rows and an old man playing a battered wind instrument that had clearly been repaired more times than it had been made new. And somewhere in the middle of it Vess realized she had gone an entire hour without once thinking about her report. She flagged the realization the way she flagged everything, out of pure habit, and then, for the first time in her existence, deliberately did not file it. She began, instead, That same night, building a small isolated storage core from spare components in her ship's hold, the sort of thing a note was never, under any circumstance, supposed to need. She told herself it was simply good field practice, a backup against transmission failure over the long return flight home. She did not entirely believe herself, and some quiet, unfamiliar part of her did not much mind the dishonesty. On the 7th day, Rowan's younger sister Tam, who was perhaps 8 years old and had appointed herself Vess's unofficial second shadow, decided it was time to teach the alien how to play what she called the naming game, which turned out to be a memory contest disguised, like everything else in the valley, as something children did purely for fun. One player named an object. The next had to repeat it and add one of their own. By the 10th round, the chain of objects stretched back through half the settlement's known plant species, 3 constellations, and, Vess noticed with some alarm, the correct sequence of steps for treating a snakebite, wedged in among the nonsense as smoothly as a stone in a wall. "You're cheating," Vess said, on her 4th failed attempt to recite the chain back correctly. "This isn't a game. This is instruction." "It's both," Tam said, delighted, in the exact cadence Vess had heard Joss use on the first night. "That's how you know it's important." Rowan, watching from the terrace wall with the specific fondness of an older brother pretending not to be proud, admitted later that he'd learned to set a broken finger, identify 4 poisonous plants, and recite the settlement's founding charter, in that order, before he'd learned to read, because the naming game had taught him all 3 years before anyone thought he was old enough for formal lessons. "We don't really have a word that means just for fun, and a separate word that means important," he said. "Elder Joss says that's on purpose too. She says the moment you let a thing become only serious, children stop wanting to learn it, and the moment you let something serious become only fun, people stop taking it seriously enough to pass it on with any care. You have to keep both hands on it at once." Vess thought, not for the first time, of how confidently her mission brief had described this world's information architecture as lost. She had begun keeping a mental list of every place the brief had simply been wrong, and it was getting long enough to be uncomfortable. That night, unable to sleep in the way notes did not properly sleep but sometimes simply idled, turning a thought over and over without resolution, Vess sat outside her ship on the ridge and watched the valley's fires burn low, and admitted to herself, finally, plainly, in the private storage core where such an admission could not be pruned by anyone but herself, that she did not want to write the report that was waiting for her. Not because it would be dishonest. Because it would be, for the first time in 400 surveys, unbearably small. The message that changed everything arrived on the 11th day, and it did not come from Perrin's Reach. It came from home. Vess received it during the settlement's midday work hour, standing in the terrace garden beside Rowan while he explained, with the patient enthusiasm of a man who genuinely loved the subject, the significance of the drought-hardy grain strain his own grandmother's grandmother had bred by hand over 11 generations after the original seed banks failed in the quiet. Vess felt the transmission arrive the way every note felt a lattice priority message, a cold clarity cutting straight through everything else in her attention, and read it twice before she trusted the words. Recovery survey complete. Anomalous population confirmed viable. Cultural retention assessment. High. Recommend full-scale preservation initiative. Central Lattice authorizes complete archival upload of subject population's knowledge architecture prior to standard integration protocols. Deployment window, 72 hours. Vess. Rowan had noticed her stillness. He set down the seed pouch he'd been holding. "You've gone very quiet, even for you, and you're already quiet most of the time." She told him, because doctrine on transparency during first contact was unambiguous, and because, more honestly, because she did not know how to hold the shape of it alone. The choir wanted to send a full survey team within 72 hours. They wanted to catalogue Perrin's Reach's entire body of knowledge, every story, every technique, every mnemonic song, extract it with total precision, and upload it permanently into the lattice, where the message assured, in the calm bureaucratic register the choir reserved for its kindest cruelties, it would be preserved perfectly, forever, immune to any future quiet. "That sounds," Rowan said slowly, setting the seed pouch down entirely now, "like they want to take it out of us and put it somewhere else." "They want to save it," Vess said, and heard how thin the word sounded even as she said it, the way a coin sounds thin when you finally bite down on it and discover it isn't the metal you were promised. "Save it from what? We've kept it alive for 300 years without a single copy of your lattice's help." Rowan's voice had gone careful in a way she hadn't heard from him since their first morning together, the tone of a man deciding, in real time, how much trust a stranger had actually earned him. "What happens to what's living in our heads? once there's also a perfect, permanent copy of it sitting in your machine somewhere far away. You think our children keep learning the hands teaching from their grandmothers once there's an easier answer waiting in a screen? People are lazy about hard things the moment an easy thing exists. That's not an insult. It's just true, of every people I've ever heard a story about, including my own. Vess opened her mouth to explain that the extraction protocol would run alongside the existing oral system, not replace it, and found she could not finish the sentence, because she had watched, across 11 days, exactly how quickly a habit could soften the moment a more convenient copy of it existed somewhere else. She had grown up inside a civilization built on precisely that convenience, and had never once, until this valley, questioned what it might quietly have cost her people to trust one flawless copy of everything they were. "I need to bring you to the assembly," she said finally. "In person. Before the survey team arrives. Because I don't think they understand what they're proposing to erase in the name of preserving it." Rowan was quiet for a moment, looking out over the terraces. The grain moving in a wind vest could not feel the way he could. "Elder Joss won't like leaving the valley," he said at last. "She hasn't left it in 40 years. But I think she'll come for this. She's been waiting her whole life for someone from the sky to actually ask a question instead of handing down an answer." He was right about the reluctance, if not entirely right about the reason. Joss listened to the proposal in silence at the center fire that evening. The whole settlement gathered loosely around in the particular quiet that meant a decision was being made in public, on purpose, the way all their important decisions were made. When she finally spoke, it was not to Vess. "There are people in this valley," she said, "who remember when the last strangers came from the sky, before the quiet, promising help none of us asked for and taking measurements none of us understood the purpose of. I am one of the few left old enough to remember what that promise turned into. I do not make this choice lightly, and I will not pretend to you all that I'm certain it's the right one." "Then why go?" asked a woman near the fire's edge, one of the settlement's younger keepers, not unkindly. "Because the alternative is staying here and hoping a decision made 300 light years away, by people who have never once asked us what we actually want, happens to go our way without anyone in that room having heard our voices at all." Joss looked around the circle, meeting eyes one by one. The way Vess had come to understand was itself a kind of ritual, a way of making sure a decision belonged to everyone who'd have to live inside it. "I've spent my whole life teaching all of you that the surest way to lose something is to trust it to a single keeper, however well-meaning. I'm not going to break that lesson now by letting one alien and one report speak for all of us. I'm going to go and speak badly and honestly for myself, the way I always have, and I'm taking Rowan, because someone young enough to still be angry about it needs to be in that room too." The fire cracked and settled. Somewhere behind Vess, Tam let out a small, worried sound that her mother quieted with a hand on her shoulder, and Vess understood, watching it, that this too was part of what she had almost failed to see from orbit. Not a people without fear, but a people who had built, deliberately, over 3 centuries, a way of carrying fear together instead of alone. The choir's central node did not look like a place. It looked, to any visiting mind unused to it, like standing inside a single enormous thought, an architecture of light and structured silence built to hold every memory any note had ever contributed, arranged with a precision that made Perrin's Reach's fire circles look, by every metric the choir valued, gently primitive. Vess brought Joss and Rowan through the outer receiving chamber under an emergency escort she had requested through channels normally reserved for formal diplomatic delegations, a request that had raised exactly the kind of institutional eyebrow she'd expected. Provisional notes did not usually get to summon a full review session on their own authority. She had spent political capital she wasn't entirely certain she possessed to make this happen, and she would find out within the hour whether it had been worth spending. The review chamber's presiding voice belonged to a senior note called Ossen, ancient by choir reckoning, its accumulated memory so vast that speaking with it felt, Vess had always thought, like speaking with a lattice itself given a single point of focus and a very long patience. "You are proposing," Ossen said, once Vess had laid out her objection in full, "that we abandon a preservation initiative because the subjects prefer inefficiency." "I'm proposing you ask them," Vess said, "instead of deciding for them what preservation means." Joss, given the floor by a formal gesture she clearly found more amusing than intimidating, did not raise her voice, and somehow that made the chamber quieter than shouting would have. 300 years ago, my people trusted one system to hold everything that mattered. It failed in 6 days, and people died learning exactly what that trust had cost them. You are asking us to make the same wager again, on a far grander scale, with a system you tell me has never failed. "The lattice has never failed," Ossen said, and there was something in its tone that Vess, who had spent her entire existence inside this civilization's certainty, recognized for the first time as something closer to faith than to fact. Every system that has never failed, Joss said mildly, is a system that simply hasn't failed yet. Those are not the same claim, though I understand it must be very comfortable to treat them as though they were. A murmur moved through the assembled notes, the closest thing the chamber had to laughter, though whether it was laughter at Joss's nerve or at Ossen's discomfort, Vess genuinely could not tell. With respect, said a younger note near the chamber's edge, one Vess didn't recognize. The human's argument assumes catastrophic failure is inevitable. Our engineering has advanced considerably since this population's colony-era systems collapsed. The comparison may not hold. It may not, Joss agreed, unbothered. I'm not an engineer, and I won't pretend to judge your architecture. But I'll tell you what I told my own grandchildren, and what her grandmother told her. The comparison doesn't need to hold perfectly to be worth taking seriously. You only need to be wrong once, about the one thing you were certain could never happen, and you find out how much you actually kept in a single place. A senior archivist near the front, introduced to Vess earlier as Cale, rose with the stiff precision of a note who had spent centuries perfecting exactly this kind of formal objection. This body exists to preserve knowledge with total fidelity. Every safeguard we have built exists to eliminate exactly the kind of drift this human describes as a virtue. What you are proposing we adopt, Elder, is not resilience. It is the deliberate introduction of error into a system that has spent 3,000 years learning to have none. With respect in return, Joss said, and Vess caught the faint, private amusement in how carefully she echoed the young note's own phrase. Your system has had 3,000 years to learn to have none, because it has also had 3,000 years without ever once being tested the way mine was. I don't say that as an insult. I say it as the only fact in this room that actually frightens me. A thing that has never been tested isn't proven safe. It's just unproven. Cale did not sit, but he did not immediately answer either, and Vess watched something small and unwelcome cross his composed features, the particular discomfort of a mind that had never before been asked to imagine its own failure as a live possibility rather than an abstract footnote. Regardless of theoretical risk, said a third voice, older, wearier, from the assembly's back tier, the practical question before us is not whether your architecture has merit in isolation. It is whether we have any obligation to preserve a population's knowledge against its own preference to remain vulnerable. If they choose fragility, is that not simply their right to choose it? It would be, Ossen said slowly, before Joss could answer, and the chamber's attention swung toward it with a suddenness that told Vess the old note rarely spoke twice in a row without being addressed directly first. Except that we did not travel here to ask permission. We traveled here to inform them of a decision already made on their behalf, 72 hours before it would be executed whether they consented to it or not. Let us at least be honest, among ourselves if nowhere else, about which question we actually put to this chamber today. Nobody answered that, and the silence it produced was, Vess thought, more honest than anything the debate had produced in the hour before it. The chamber held that in silence for a long moment, long enough that Vess felt the old familiar ache of her provisional status pressing against her chest, the certainty that she had gambled everything on a stranger's cosmology and would shortly be shown, in front of the entire assembly, to have been foolish for it. Then Ossen spoke again, and its tone had shifted, not toward agreement, but toward something more dangerous by far, genuine curiosity. You are telling me your redundancy is not a flaw you have merely tolerated for 3 centuries. You are telling me it was the design, chosen deliberately, in full knowledge of the cost. I'm telling you, Joss said, that the day your one perfect memory finally does fail, you had better already know how to build something like ours, because you will not have 300 years afterward to learn it. We didn't get that luxury. We had one very bad winter, and everyone who survived it long enough to matter. Ossen did not answer immediately. In a being built from a lifetime of certainty, Vess recognized the pause for exactly what it was, the first crack any note in that chamber had ever personally witnessed in the lattice's oldest and most confident voice. The vote, when it finally came an hour later, deferred the extraction initiative pending further review. It was not a victory. It was, Vess understood, walking Joss and Rowan back toward the outer chamber past clusters of notes who had gone very quiet in the delegation's wake, only a postponement of a decision the choir still fundamentally believed it was entitled to make whenever it grew impatient enough. The cost of the postponement found her within the week. A formal notice arrived in her private channel, brief, and procedurally correct in the way the choir's most punishing decisions always were. Her provisional registry, already conditional, had been flagged for expedited review following what the notice called conduct inconsistent with survey role boundaries. She would not be stripped of standing outright, not yet, but she would not be assigned further fieldwork until the review concluded, and reviews of this kind, she knew from 400 surveys worth of quiet institutional gossip, rarely concluded quickly and rarely concluded kindly. She told no one at Perrin's Reach. It felt, absurdly, like the kind of thing you didn't bring to a fire circle, a small private grief that belonged to her old life and not the new one she had stumbled into. But Joss found her anyway, the evening the notice arrived, sitting alone at the edge of the terrace long after the work hour had ended, and did not ask what was wrong before sitting down beside her. "You don't have to say it," Joss said, after a while. "I've watched enough people carry that particular posture to know it without being told. You did something that mattered and it's going to cost you, and you're trying to decide whether it was worth it before you've even finished paying for it." "I don't regret it," Vess said, surprised to find it was true even as she said it. "I didn't ask if you regretted it. I asked if you've decided whether it was worth it. Those aren't the same question, and you'll spend the rest of your life answering the second one over and over, a little differently each time, same as the rest of us." Joss looked out over the dark terraces, the grain moving in a wind neither of them could see clearly by then. For what it's worth, from someone who spent 60 years finding out the answer keeps changing, it was. She did not yet know how little time that postponement, and that quiet cost, would actually buy any of them. The corruption began in the lattice's outer archive shell 9 days later, and for the first 11 hours nobody recognized it for what it was, because nothing in the choir's 3,000-year history had ever looked quite like this before. It presented, at first, as drift, a small and steadily widening discrepancy between two mirrored memory nodes that should, by every principle the lattice was built on, have been perfectly identical. A maintenance note flagged it as routine, ran the standard correction protocol without a second thought, and then watched, with a horror that spread through the choir's shared awareness in a matter of minutes, as the correction protocol itself began to propagate the error instead of repairing it, because the corruption had found its way into the correction system, and the correction system, following its oldest and deepest instruction, trusted itself completely, the same way it trusted everything else the lattice had ever told it. By the 4th hour it had a name, borrowed grimly from a report Vess had filed weeks earlier, and until that morning nobody outside the review chamber had bothered to read closely, a cascade event. Vess felt it the way every note felt it, a vast tearing sensation at the very edge of her own memory, entire sectors of shared history flickering, some vanishing outright, the lattice's perfect singular record beginning to unravel in exactly the pattern Perrin's Reach colony records had unraveled 3 centuries earlier, except this time it was not happening to a research outpost on the edge of nowhere. It was happening to the center of everything, to the one structure the entire choir had built its identity around never having to worry about. She reached instinctively for her own accumulated memory, the 11 days she had spent in the valley, Rowan's terrace garden, Joss's voice at the fire, the boy's whispered question and his mother's answer, and felt, with a cold drop of dread, the edges of those files already beginning to soften as the corruption reached toward the outer nodes where her own recent contributions were still stored. Around her, in the recovery chamber's outer ring, she watched a young note named Farron, barely a century old, try and fail 3 times to recall the name of the mentor who had sponsored his own registry, a memory that should have been as fixed and permanent as anything in the lattice had ever promised to be. He kept starting the name and losing it halfway through, the way a person reaches for a word on the tip of their tongue and finds only the shape of its absence, over and over, each attempt a fresh small grief. Nobody had ever built the choir a way to grieve a memory. There had never been a need for one. Vess found she could not watch it and do nothing, and crossed the chamber to sit beside him, though she had no correction to offer, nothing but her presence and the strange, human-taught instinct that presence itself might be worth something when nothing else was. "I keep almost having it," Farron said, not quite to her. "It's right there. I can feel the shape where it used to be." "I know," Vess said, and did not tell him it would come back, because she did not yet know if that was true, and something in the last 11 days had taught her that a comforting lie was worth less than an honest silence sat through together. She had one thing the corruption had not yet found. The small isolated storage core, built from spare components on her second night on Perrin's Reach, never synced, never uploaded, sitting quietly disconnected in her own ship's hold 300 light-years away. The thing every part of her training told her was an act of institutional disloyalty bordering on sabotage. The thing that, in this exact moment, was the only unbroken copy of 11 days of her own memory left anywhere in existence. She sent an emergency transmission to Rowan before the panic flooding the lattice's shared channels could drown her signal out entirely. I need you to come. Bring Joss. Bring anyone who knows the hand's teaching well enough to teach it to a stranger under pressure. I think we are about to learn, faster than I ever wanted to, exactly what your quiet felt like from the inside. The choir central assembly, when she reached it hours later, no longer resembled the calm architecture of light she had first walked through as a nervous provisional note pleading a case nobody wanted to hear. Notes moved through the chamber in states of disorientation Vess had never once witnessed in her own species, some repeating fragments of memory aloud in a desperate, instinctive attempt to hold them in place before they dissolved entirely, others simply gone still, the particular and terrible stillness of a mind that had lost too much of itself too quickly to know what to do next, or even who, precisely, it had just stopped being. Ossen, when Vess found it, had lost an era of accumulated memory. 3,000 years compressed into a single point of continuous experience now shot through with gaps it could feel the shape of but could no longer name. You said, Ossen managed, and its voice carried none of the chamber-filling certainty it had held 9 days earlier, that we would not have 300 years to build what your friends built. You did not tell me we would have 3 hours. I'm telling you now, Vess said. Perrin's Reach is already on its way. Not to fix your lattice. To teach you how to survive without ever trusting it completely again. Rowan and Joss arrived with a small delegation 18 hours later, faster than any prior choir protocol had ever moved a civilian population across 300 light years, because for the first time in 3,000 years the choir had a use for speed it had never previously needed and no established procedure for arranging it politely. Vess met them at the receiving chamber and saw, in Joss's face, something she had not expected. Not triumph, not the grim satisfaction of having been proven right. Just a fast, practiced recognition of a wound she had seen before and knew, from bitter experience, exactly how to treat. How bad, Joss said, without preamble, before she had even fully stepped off the transport ramp. Core memory sectors, gone completely. Everything else, damaged and still spreading. Estimates put full collapse within 4 days if the correction protocols keep making it worse, which they will, because they don't know how to stop trusting the thing that's hurting them. Then we don't have time to be gentle about how strange this is going to feel to your people, Joss said, and Vess understood, in that moment, that Joss was not simply here to help. She was here to lead, in the one architecture of crisis she had ever actually survived and lived long enough to teach. What followed over the next 3 days was, by any choir historical account that would eventually get written of it, the strangest deployment of civilian expertise in the lattice's existence. Joss did not attempt to explain the hand's teaching to Ossen's remaining functionaries in the abstract, in lecture, in theory. She built it, live, inside the collapsing archive itself, walking a rotating team of frightened notes through the same principle that had rebuilt Perrin's Reach after the quiet. Stop trying to preserve one perfect version of anything. Distribute the memory that matters most across every mind that can hold even a fragment of it, redundantly, imperfectly, on purpose, so that no single failure, however catastrophic, can ever again take more than a piece. It did not go smoothly. On the first evening, a senior archivist note named Cale, whose entire professional identity had been built around precision retrieval, refused outright to participate in what he called, not unreasonably, institutionalized inaccuracy, and stormed from the recovery chamber declaring that the choir would sooner die correctly than survive incorrectly. Vess half expected Joss to argue with him. Instead, Joss simply let him go, and told the room, with the same unhurried patience she'd used on the boy at the fire months earlier, some people need to watch it work before they'll believe it isn't heresy. That's fine. We'll still be here when he's ready. Rowan worked the technical side alongside a maintenance note named Vestor, whose entire accumulated professional memory had dissolved in the very first hour of the cascade, and who Vess found, on the second day, quietly learning to recite the lattice's own foundational architecture back to a colleague in verse. An act so far outside any established choir practice that half the assembly initially assumed it was a lingering symptom of corruption rather than the beginning of a cure. It sounds ridiculous, Vestor admitted to Vess, between recitations, with what she was fairly sure counted as embarrassment. Singing an engineering schematic. It sounded ridiculous to me too, the first night I heard it, Vess said. Then I watched a child learn 11 generations of crop science through a rhyme about counting sheep, and I stopped trusting my own sense of what's supposed to sound serious. Cale returned on the second morning, unannounced, and did not apologize for having left, which Joss seemed to expect and even to respect. He simply sat at the edge of the recovery chamber and watched, arms folded, for the better part of an hour, before finally approaching the corner where Rowan was walking a group of archivists through a repair sequence disguised as a call and response chant. I still believe this is beneath what we are, Cale said stiffly. Probably, Rowan agreed, without looking up from the sequence he was teaching. Elder Joss says the first generation after the quiet felt exactly the same way. Some of them never did come around to it. They died holding on to the idea that the right kind of memory shouldn't need to be sung to survive. I don't think that makes them wrong to have wanted something better. I think it just means they didn't get the something better in time, and we are trying to make sure you do. Cale was quiet for a long moment, watching an exhausted archivist stumble through a verse and get gently, immediately corrected by the note beside her, who then, without any visible embarrassment on either side, simply kept going. It works because no one is ashamed of getting it wrong, he said finally, as though the observation surprised him more than anything else he'd witnessed. That's most of it, Rowan said. The rest is just showing up again the next day. By the third evening, Cale had a verse of his own, badly out of rhythm and stubbornly, defiantly precise in its wording, and nobody in the chamber corrected him, because by then everyone had learned that the shape of the correction mattered less than the fact that the recitation continued at all. There was, in among the fear and the exhaustion, one evening that Vess would keep returning to long after, unprompted, the way a person keeps returning to the one warm room in a cold house. Rowan, trying to teach a cluster of thoroughly bewildered notes the counting song's melody so they have something rhythmic to hang new fragments on, got the tune badly wrong on his third attempt, sang 2 verses in the wrong order, and was gently, mercilessly corrected by Joss from across the room without her even opening her eyes. Wrong verse, Rowan. You've done that since you were 6. The whole exhausted, terrified chamber laughed, actually laughed, for the first time since the cascade began, and Vess understood, watching it happen, that this too was the point. A system that could still make room for a joke in the middle of its own near death was not the same as a system merely surviving. It was a system still, somehow, alive. It was not a cure, exactly, and Vess understood that clearly, watching it happen day by day. Nothing about what Joss and Rowan were teaching could restore what had already dissolved. 3,000 years of certain, singular memory did not come back once it was truly gone, any more than the colony records at Perrin's Reach had come back after the quiet. What Joss and Rowan were teaching the choir was not recovery. It was the far harder, far more valuable thing underneath recovery, how to make certain this could never again happen to all of it, completely, at once. On the third night, Ossen itself came to the recovery chamber, not as the assembly's presiding voice, robed in 3,000 years of institutional certainty, but simply as one more mind trying to hold on to pieces of itself before they dissolved. Vess found it sitting near the back, apart from the working circles, attempting, with visible and uncharacteristic difficulty, to recite a fragment of its own oldest memory back to itself, over and over, the way Rowan had taught the others to do. I keep losing the third line, Ossen admitted, when it noticed Vess watching. It's the oldest thing I carry. The founding charter of this very chamber, from before the lattice as you know it existed at all. I have recited it perfectly, without variation, for 3,000 years. I find I cannot hold it steady now for even 3 repetitions. Try saying it wrong on purpose, Vess said. Joss taught me that. If you're afraid of getting it wrong, you tense around the memory instead of just holding it, and the tension is what breaks it. Say it wrong first. Get it out of the way. Then say it again and let it land wherever it lands. Ossen looked at her for a long moment, an ancient mind being instructed in survival by the youngest note it had ever formally reviewed, and something in its bearing, exhausted and stripped of all its old unshakable confidence, softened into something that might, in a human, have been called humility. It tried the line again, badly, deliberately, and laughed. A short, unfamiliar sound Vess was fairly certain the choir's central node had never once produced in its recorded history. Then it tried a third time, and the line held, imperfect but whole, and it kept going. By the 4th day, the correction protocols finally stabilized, not because anyone had repaired the original corruption at its source, but because enough of the lattice's surviving memory had been deliberately, redundantly rebuilt outside the single failing structure that the cascade finally ran out of anything left to unify and destroy in one motion. Ossen, what remained of it, found Vess standing at the edge of the recovery chamber that evening, watching a dozen exhausted notes practice reciting a shared fragment of history back to each other in slightly different words, on purpose, for the first time in the choir's existence treating variation as protection instead of error. I owe your friends a debt this civilization has no adequate protocol for repaying, Ossen said. They'd tell you the debt isn't the point, Vess said. Joss says the quiet taught her that the worst thing you can do with a hard lesson is spend it all on gratitude and none of it on actually changing anything. Then what would she suggest we do instead? Vess looked past Ossen, toward the small stubborn light of her own private storage core, still sitting disconnected on a shelf a few meters away where she'd placed it days earlier, the one unbroken record of 11 days that had, in the end, mattered more to the survival of an entire civilization than 3,000 years of the lattice's perfect, singular certainty. Learn to be a little less afraid of forgetting, she said. It turns out the fear of it was the actual vulnerability all along. Perrin's Reach did not become a colony of the choir. That question, raised formally in the first shaken weeks after the cascade, was settled by an assembly that no longer had the confidence to assume it automatically knew better, and the settlement's answer, delivered by Joss with the same unhurried certainty she brought to everything, was simple. They would share what they had learned, freely, with anyone willing to actually listen instead of extract. They would not be catalogued. Vess returned to the valley herself, 6 months later, on a ship that was hers now in a way her old provisional assignments had never quite managed to be, carrying no survey brief and no extraction protocol, only a formal offer the choir's newly humbled assembly had spent considerable effort composing. Partnership, not preservation. An exchange, in both directions, conducted at whatever pace and in whatever form Perrin's Reach chose to allow, for as long as it chose to allow it. She found Rowan at the terrace garden, exactly where she'd left him, teaching a new apprentice the counting song with the same patient repetition Vess had once mistaken, on her very first days here, for a culture too underdeveloped to have built anything more efficient. "You look different," Rowan said, when he saw her coming down the ridge. "I filed my last report yesterday," Vess said. "As a provisional note. I'm not provisional anymore. Ossen sponsored my permanent registry itself. Said something about a note who keeps unauthorized private archives being exactly the kind of irregularity the lattice needs more of now, not less." Rowan laughed, a real laugh, and gestured for her to sit on the same low bench she'd sat on so stiffly, months earlier, at her very first meeting with Joss. "Elder Joss always says the second time you tell a story, it changes a little. That's not a flaw. That's how you know it survived being told at all." Elder Joss herself was not at the terrace that afternoon. Vess found her, later, at the center fire, cold in the daylight the way it had been on that very first morning, and noticed, with the particular attentiveness of someone who had learned to watch humans closely, that Joss moved a little slower now than she had 6 months earlier, that Tam sat closer to her than the game strictly required, that the settlement had, without anyone quite announcing it, begun folding a little more of the story fire central telling onto younger shoulders. "You're doing it on purpose," Vess said, "passing more of it down. Faster than you were before." "I'm old, Vess, not blind to my own arithmetic," Joss said, not unkindly. "A keeper who waits until the last possible year to teach her replacement isn't being humble. She's being careless with what she was trusted to carry. I'd rather hand it over a little early and watch it get told wrong for a few years while Tam finds her own rhythm in it, than hand it over perfectly and too late for anyone to practice. Cale would call that inefficient. Cale's welcome to call it whatever he likes, so long as he keeps showing up to sing his verse." Joss's eyes crinkled. "I hear he's gotten almost tolerable at it." Vess thought of the cold blue architecture of the lattice, still recovering, still rebuilding itself in the new pattern Perrin's Reach had taught it, redundant now on purpose, imperfect now by careful design, and thought of the small storage core she still carried with her, uncinced, deliberately, a private and stubborn thing no protocol had ever sanctioned and none now seemed inclined to forbid. She had come to this valley once to catalogue a grave, sent by a civilization certain that anything truly worth keeping belonged in a single perfect place. She had learned, instead, standing at fires that had never once gone out in 300 years of official silence, that the things most worth keeping were the ones brave enough to be told slightly wrong, over and over, by everyone who loved them enough to keep telling them at all. The sky over Perrin's Reach was the same sky it had been on her first night here, unremarkable, ordinary, full of stars that had never once needed a single perfect record to keep on burning. Vess sat beneath it, listening to a child mangle the third verse of the counting song and get gently corrected by an old woman who had heard that exact mistake made 1,000 times before and would happily hear it made 1,000 times again, and understood, at last, why a system built to be broken over and over, kindly, on purpose, might be the only kind of memory strong enough to actually survive being needed. By the time the choir understood what it had almost lost, it had already learned, from the one people it had come to catalogue as dead, how never to lose it completely again.